big name conferences like Velocity and OSCON and places like that, like it probably is almost better suited to local meetups. And that was one of the things that Yuri and I were like talking about a little bit.
Yeah, I would definitely planning once the sort of context propagation API stuff has cleared the deck. I would love to putting a lot more focus on documentation, onboarding, and then local meetups, people who are specifically interested in tracing getting together, having birds of a feather session and doing these workshops. I think that'd be really great. Especially since we've got such a great community that's kind of spread out. We're not just in the Bay, right? We're, all over the world. So there's a lot of opportunity to start running some meetups and things, in a bunch of different localities. And I see Yuri's here. Hey, Yuri. Ben just gave a bit of a summary about the Open Tracing workshop, but I was wondering if there's anything you'd want to follow that up with.
Oh, sorry, I missed the update. I think it went well. I mean, people were engaged, but many people were not experts in tracing. Like I think 2/3 have never heard of tracing at that workshop. So yeah. I'm happy that we finished the tutorials. Like there's one language like Node.js still pending. There is a PR, some left out. But yeah, going forward, I think this set of tutorials gives us a good foundation to actually run this, and like we can have a lot more people running them.
Awesome. Yeah, I find it heartening that people who have never done tracing before could do the workshop and make it all the way to the end. So I think that's actually
yeah, that's why I think after OSCon, when we had this like a list of things people can do from easy to advanced, and we realized that most of them are going to be very new to that. So my tutorials are very basic. There's like, it's essentially hello world, which in tutorial 3 splits it into like microservices, but one line microservices. So it's just pure illustration of some of the most basic topics. It doesn't even talk about like things, how I do concurrent, like asynchronous frameworks with the new active span. Right? I don't think that has to be within the workshop. It's too advanced for that.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Going down the list, Spoons from Lightstep gave a talk at Strange Loop, pretty good talk, not super specifically open tracing, but some discussion about sampling and things that I think people might find interesting. So I threw it on the list. And then I think the next big upcoming conference that I know about is KubeCon in December. I'm definitely going to try to have a strong presence there. And we'll be definitely giving another workshop. And I forget, where is that KubeCon? Do you remember, Ben?
In December?
Yeah.
It's in Texas.
Austin.
Yeah, that's right. It's in Austin. Sorry, my phone I had to unmute. Yeah, it's in Austin, and there's another thing that just came up yesterday that I actually don't think I'm going to do, to be honest, but if someone else wants to, let me know and I can try and get you to do it. Expedia is kind of a conglomerate of different travel brands. Like I didn't even realize this till yesterday, but like Orbitz and I don't know, I can't even remember, but there are like 6 or 7 travel related brands that are part of Expedia. And they have an internal like international conference for their own company that's also in Austin. And on November 1st, they were asking for like a keynote about tracing. I just can't do it logistically, but if someone here thinks that sounds like a great opportunity, to send me a note or something. I mean, I think it would be cool to kind of spread the word. I'm not going to fly to Austin for that, I don't think, but just given my family life right now, but it's something that we could do if we wanted to.
Okay. Expedia, didn't they just acquire a ride-sharing company?
No comment. Yeah.
Silly joke. Okay.
Just wait.
Just added that add that to meeting notes. Maybe make an announcement about that in Gitter, just so people in the community have a chance to take that opportunity if they want it. All right, moving right along. Specification updates. New Relic announced support. Hooray! New Relic. Is there anyone on the call today from New Relic?
Yeah, we have quite a large contingent. My name's Erica. I'm the person being added in that spec as the representative to show up on these calls and chat with y'all. We're pretty excited to participate. We also have Chris Wildman and Matt Ware on the line as well. We're all really interested in this project and eager to learn what y'all are talking about. And yeah, thanks for having us.
No problem. Welcome to the community. Feel free to hop in at any time on these calls and ask questions. We tend to use these calls as a way of just kind of surfacing everything that's going on and using it as an opportunity to try to coordinate efforts and make sure things that need attention are getting it. We tend to try, if it starts to turn into a debate on the call, rather than try to debate things out in this setting because it's kind of awkward, we try to just schedule a time or a place for people to continue that GitHub issue. So that's how they tend to go. And yeah, and feel free to add anything to the meeting notes, and there'll be a chance at the end to bring anything up that you want. So we've got them. Datadog, you guys should make an announcement at some point. That's going to be my poke at Datadog. All right. The next bit around unstable release structure. So I added this in here. I would like to kind of formalize this in a real doc at some point, but this is just sort of an update around the direction the Java API has been going. So prior API changes sort of took the form of a very large PR and then a very large discussion on that PR. And it sort of felt with the last version of the API, we had kind of reached the limits of that approach, where it was really hard for those discussions to resolve, or for there to really be enough space for experimentation and actually exercising the API choices that we were discussing. So there's been a sort of natural evolution towards what looks to be kind of a stable, unstable release structure, where rather than just making a change directly to the API, keeping a separate branch labeled the next version that's separate from master, and making that be the sort of unstable version, and adding a series of changes there, having tracers actually bind to the API, and then sort of port the instrumentation over and really try to exercise that. And so we issued a release candidate for the newest Java API, and people started to bind to that last week. And I feel like already that's made a large difference. We very quickly encountered a bunch of different interesting pieces of instrumentation where we were wondering whether the new simplified API was going to be good enough. So far, it seems to be fine for the intended purposes that we were looking for. So that's going well. But sorry, I kind of drifted into talking about Java, but just to keep on this sort of structure, does anyone have any comments on this at the time? Or seen just from what we've been doing with Java, does this feel like a good or a bad direction that we're going? Because it feels good to me, but I would love to hear feedback from other people on moving to this new approach. I'm seeing some nods. People can't hear nods.
So I think it was definitely warranted. We definitely needed to have something to be able to allow us to get those release jars out. I think the semantics around it are a little bit interesting.
Yeah.
So still trying to get used to it. But
yeah,
I mean, it certainly seemed to release a log jam of activity.
Yeah, it was definitely a good change. And by semantics, you mean referring to things like a release candidate, or maybe just the fact that it's not really documented and we're kind of experimenting with it at the time. So it's not really like written down exactly how we're doing it.
Maybe a little bit of both.
Yeah. Java is
definitely to me, like my kind of orthodoxy from developing software, just internally would be that master should generally be the place where you're not going to commit stuff that's not tested and so on, but like master is the place where you see the latest code, and then you'd cut release branches off of that when you had a release candidate, and then you would apply patches to the release candidate branch until there was a release, and then that would be that, and then that would be that. But this is like a really different model, but I think it actually is probably the right thing for open source, where you can say what you will about documentation and readmes pointing to certain artifacts, but the reality is that like people are going to look at master and assume that that's what they should be looking at, even if so like making master an unstable, or I shouldn't say unstable, making master the place where things haven't been vetted, like beyond a pull request, right? But we're talking about more like actually literally vetting it with instrumentation. Like master does need to be the thing that represents like what people should be instrumenting against right now. So I think that aspect of the current scheme is counterintuitive to me based on my this kind of like muscle memory around developing software in other contexts. But I think for this situation, it makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
I agree. I think that in the future, it would be nice to have master continue to be like the main development branch, and have a fork, or a branch for long-term support.
Yeah. That definitely sounds like a good debate to have.
In the Go world.
So go ahead, Chris.
In the Go world, too many people just pull right off master, which is good. It's cool, but yeah, I don't know. I sometimes live in fear of bad code going to master on dependencies that are unexpected. Yeah, so I'd be in favor of a release branch for the Go side.
Yeah, it's also
I mean, poor boss is like like I see the open tracing Zipkin Go stuff gets broken by a dependency on like a bi-weekly basis, and it's never something that could be prevented given like the way that scheme works. It's a very frustrating experience.
Yeah, well, with Go Vet kind of, or sorry, not Vet, DEP, starting to get standardized with some manifest stuff. Hopefully that will smooth out at least the transitive dependencies not being what you expect. But I kind of agree with Chris. I think we should hash it out. There's plenty of nuance here. But my only concern with master pointing at unstable is there's usually a certain amount of documentation and stuff in the readmes and everything, and I think it might just be confusing to people if there's sort of skew between some things being unstable and some things being stable. I would just be concerned with, like Chris saying, people pulling things off of master and building and having an API mismatch between instrumentation and the API repos. But I think there's ways to mitigate that. There's also, for example, having a develop branch in addition to master or something like that, and then both pointing at things. And then you can also pick which is the default branch that you see when you look on GitHub. So I think there's ways to kind of massage those things out into something acceptable. Does anyone else have any general comments on this sort of branch structure we're going to at this time? Otherwise, I'll move on to the Java stuff. Cool. We're moving on. And I'm just going to talk to kind of keep the meeting going, but feel free to interrupt me if you want to stop and discuss something. I don't mind. So moving on to Java, we've got a release candidate out for version 31. Very excited about that. Excited to see tracers binding to it. Lightstep, we've got a version now bound to it this week. We're starting to port instrumentation over. And I've seen a couple other groups do the same thing. Just interesting, can we just kind of maybe go around? Is there a way to chat in this thing? This Zoom thing? I don't know. It'd be interesting if people could just sound off who's actually got a tracer that is ported over. There's chat. If people wouldn't mind mentioning in chat if they've got a version that's either ported over or in the process. I see we got Jaeger. That's great. Lightstep. I don't think Pavel's on the call, but I know he made at least a PR against Open Tracing Brave to try to bring that over. So that I know that's in flight as well.
I'm here.
Hey, Pavel.
Yeah, it's. I think it could be merged soon.
Oh, good. Sweet. And that's definitely a good start. Yes. Datadog, you're still in the process of like building your Java tracer, right? So you've got like extra work to do.
What about any instrumentation? Because tracers are the easy part.
Yeah. Yeah. Pavel, I know at Red Hat you guys have been moving things over, right?
Yeah, I think Gary did the servlet filter and the Spring Web.
Nice.
I just commented today that about the auto closing on the scope close.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's like maybe we should change that to not close this, not finish the span.
Like change the default to not.
Change the default, yes.
Yeah. That's good feedback.
Yeah, there are various reasons to. I commented on the issue for the release candidate, so it may be better to read that.
Yeah. Okay. Do you mind maybe putting a link in the spec meeting notes? Yeah, I know. So one thing we're working on at Lightstep, Carlos Alberto, who's been working on the Java API, is in the process of trying to port Akka, create some Akka instrumentation against this API, because there's been some concern in particular about kind of async frameworks and Scala things, and whether they were going to be fine with this API or whether they wanted something more like continuations. And so we felt the need to get more asynchronous stuff instrumented just to make sure that we painted this thing correctly. But so far, so good. Has anyone encountered anything with the API that they are concerned about in terms of it making the instrumentation too difficult or otherwise awkward, or is it mostly going well?
Yeah, can you say that one more time?
I was just curious if anyone had any other feedback. I know, Gary, you ran into what you thought was a roadblock, but then were able to get around it. So I'm just curious about.
Yeah, I mean, apart from that one issue that we found a workaround, it was fine. Yeah.
Great. Cool. And I know you were having you guys were doing some trickiness around using the previous API to detect leaks in instrumentation, right? And you had some concerns about whether you'd be able to continue doing that stuff.
Yeah, I think we'll make it work with the current API.
Cool. Yeah, I'd definitely be interested in like leak detection or some other form of being able to tell whether instrumentation is correct through either analysis. I think that's an interesting. Okay, and
yeah, Ted. One other thing I would say is I don't. It's just one of those things. Like Marston, MABN, Mabin on GitHub had mentioned that a desire to capture state beyond the span itself when you're creating a closure, or capturing things into a closure, and the fact that we don't have a function call to hook into makes it kind of impossible to do that. Like I personally think that's like sort of collateral damage I'm willing to live with if everything else is a lot simpler. But to the best of my knowledge, like the ref counting thing, you can always do it yourself. But that piece is it's harder to do in like a consistent way unless open tracing has a hook to capture that kind of state. I also think it's again, I think it's not like a deal breaker, but seems like semantically like the biggest thing that we would lose by moving to the 31 version.
Yeah, and just to clarify what BHS is saying, there was an initial impetus to make open tracing and MDC kind of work seamlessly. I believe that's the specific example Mavin was interested in. And that's really where that capture call came in handy. But yeah, I do question whether that just kind of represented an overreach, like something that would have been great if open tracing could come in and kind of solve the MDC problem and things like that. But it seems like it pushed the API into something that was overcomplicated, and is ultimately like, yeah, maybe not the core thing we should be solving. All right. Well, that's all I have to say about the Java API at this moment. Does anyone have any questions or any concerns they want to raise at this time on this topic?
So how long, just a quick question on the Java thing, how long do we anticipate it to be in this kind of release candidate state for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know. We haven't set any kind of explicit deadline, and my hope was that if we could successfully continue to port instrumentation over, and there would be some kind of tipping point where we felt like the instrumentation we had ported was sufficient, and the number of tracers that had bound to it were sufficient, and we weren't actively considering any other changes, then we would roll it out. And I know that's kind of a mealy-mouthed answer. Yuri's writing by December in Cloud Native. Yeah, my God, I hope it's out by December. But we could make a commitment to try to be ready to release by the end of this month. That would give us 3 more weeks to kind of vet things, and at least finalize whatever other changes we're going to go into this API release. I know there's some debate about like time units and some other stuff that maybe people want to get in there. And I know from talking to Matt Perpick last night, there was some question about start active and whether like, that could go back to being start or something like that. And I don't know if we can tackle that or not, but there's an opportunity to do a little bit of cleanup to the API if people want to do it. Maybe that's a can of worms we don't want to open.
Seems to me like,
sorry, go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say that we, I like, for instance, that we're on the tracer side. I don't like. I mean, it's just not that big of a deal. Like, it's not a hard change. As Yuri was saying, the hard thing is instrumentation, and not just making sure it's possible, but making sure it's kind of fluent. And I like that we're explicitly going after some of the ones that are likely to be most problematic. Like, I think if we just, I feel really confident that the proposed API is fine in like at least 95% of cases. I think we just need to like pursue those potential 5% as aggressively as possible. I think like the Akka thing is a perfect example of that. And I think if we can prove to ourselves, well, actually that's the wrong word. If we can give ourselves confidence that even in these situations where there is a lot of asynchrony and where like the complexity of the previous API might have had some real leverage, like if we can convince ourselves it wasn't necessary, then it becomes a matter of just software engineering. I think right now most of the delay is more around making sure that we feel confident in, that the community next year won't be like, oh shit, like why'd you do this? So I think it's really about forestalling that issue, which is a bit different than the software engineering effort, which is actually not, to my mind, is like pretty small in terms of wall time by comparison.
Yeah. And as like Pavel's mentioned in the comments, yeah, Akka, Vertex, things that potentially are boundary pushing. We want to make sure we've attacked some of those. But I'm also confident because the people who were kind of from the Scala background, Ivan, I can't remember his last name, but people who are working on instrumenting that stuff professionally were some of the people who are advocating to get rid of the continuations and go to something more like scope. So that's also something that gives me like faith that this is something that works when instrumenting that stuff, given the people who do it professionally we're kind of advocating for it. But maybe what we should do is, because we're already getting asked in Gitter and other places for some kind of timeline, we can make a commitment to try to have everything wrapped up in a month, and then at the next OTSC meeting call, agree to pull the trigger. Does that sound like a good check-in point to people? Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, yeah, sure. Could even, I could imagine like if a bunch of these things go really smoothly that we could even have a conference earlier than that, but we'll see.
Yeah. I don't want to jinx it by being too ambitious.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is just that, like, while we wait, like, I'm aware of a bunch of organizations that are moving to the open tracing API as it stands now. So it's like, as time passes, like, there's just code debt being created, and it's just like, it's kind of a bummer. So that's why I feel something like that's one of the many reasons why I feel urgency around it.
Well, that makes sense. All right. Well, maybe in 2 weeks. So 2 weeks from now, I'm back in my calendar. Like, let's have a check-in maybe on the 20th. That Friday would be 2 weeks from now, or something that week. Maybe starting that Wednesday, the 18th, in Gitter. We can start making announcements on that day to kind of get a sense of where people are at, and maybe have a target if people can try to feel like they have everything they would need to launch by the 20th. That will be a forcing factor to make sure anything that's going to surface does surface in the next 2 weeks. and then gives us a little leeway if there is a need to correct things. And if not, maybe we can just release at that point. Okay. That sounds fine. I'm going to make a note. To all right. All right. Okay. Anything else on Java? All right. We can always come back to at the end if someone thinks of something. So moving on to ecosystem updates, something I've been working on with Ryan Byrne, who's holding down the kind of API, has been instrumenting proxies and getting open tracing into Nginx and Envoy and HaProxy, and trying to figure out what the best strategy is there. And we have Nginx instrumented with open tracing. We hadn't brought it over to OT contribute because we were still working on what the sort of linking model should look like. We weren't satisfied with having to compile in the tracer. Right now in Nginx, you not only have to compile in the open tracing plugin, but also the tracer, which we didn't really like. We'd prefer a model where, you can have a sort of open tracing compliant Nginx release as a binary people can take and just like link it to the tracer that they want to use. And so while we're in the process of that, we posted on the Nginx mailing list, and then Kubernetes scooped it up and brought it into Ingress to start adding at least Zipkin. Looks like they've compiled Zipkin in. And so that was pretty great to see.
I think we lost Ted.
Hey, I got kicked off the call. Sorry about that. I don't know what people missed.
You're talking about Nginx.
All right. So anyways, long story short, we've started adding open tracing to Nginx and proxies, and it almost immediately got picked up as soon as we posted to the mailing list for people to check it out, and got added, at least in some experimental form, to Kubernetes Ingress. So that was a great win that kind of came out of the blue. We weren't even out of the starting gate yet, and it's already going places. So that's given me a lot of confidence that open tracing and proxies are going to be two things that really work well with each other.
Did you have any info in terms of the overall integration of open tracing and Kubernetes as a distributed system?
I have some statement that. I mean, I spent about, I don't know, cumulatively about 90 minutes talking with them about it, and they were interested in not really understanding like the type of thing that a tracing system does. So Kubernetes is like this giant state machine, and the individual requests that come in and modify the state machine happen quickly. Like that wasn't latency in that regard, and even what was happening wasn't that interesting. But then the state machine ends up triggering, it's a state machine, so it triggers this like massive amount of activity. And it's that massive amount of activity is really what they wanted to model. And I think that they did recognize that it would be possible with sufficient effort to model that using open tracing primitives or something like that. But it was like a true DAG, not like a sort of, yeah, I know, right? Xtrace, thumbs up. But I think the concern that Kubernetes had was that like they weren't going to be able to use like really anything that they were aware of on the tracer side to accomplish the goals they had analytically. It wasn't like standard latency analysis. It was almost more like debugging this like fairly complicated state machine. So I think they decided to go, I I didn't read the proposal in any detail, but they wrote this like Kubernetes events proposal, which is really just a way of like describing state transitions and all of the events that take place, and then building their own like totally ad hoc analytics tool to understand and debug when Kubernetes doesn't do the right thing, which I can actually think might make a lot of sense, frankly. Like it's not like the types of problems they were trying to solve were very specialized to what they were doing, and the actual request response piece was not interesting to them. Like it's not like they were having performance problems or semantic questions around that. It's just like what happens afterwards. So that's why like they had this PR, and the guy who was doing it was like, yeah, we could easily add open tracing or whatever to like model the latency of those actual like the initial request that comes in, but that's not what their concern was. I don't know if that helps you understand where they're coming from.
Okay.
Yeah. There's the other place, which is just, Nginx isn't just a control plane. It's also part of the data plane in the sense that ingress and load balancing and things like that also are part of the Nginx structure, and, working to pods and things. So where I kind of see open tracing and Kubernetes being more interesting is on that sort of, data plane layer, people tracing their applications that are running in Kubernetes and wanting to see the pieces of Kubernetes infrastructure that those requests are hitting and routing through, or at least being able to get their request spans tagged with something that would be able to let them figure out how things were relating to, Kubernetes, like deployment topology and stuff like that. So that's the place where I see it as useful, and that's why I'm not totally surprised it's been put into Ingress. But I do plan on following up with them now to kind of figure out how we're going to expand that offering, because I think right now it's just sort of hardwired to Zipkin. And obviously, if it's open tracing, we want people to be able to plug in whatever.
If it's an email or GitHub, please add me to that conversation.
Yeah, I should also say, that's what I was saying earlier, that was really, to be clear, that was Kubernetes, understanding Kubernetes. It wasn't like Kubernetes is a platform people run applications. So like for that type of stuff, whether it's, using Istio or whatever, that's a totally separate story, and one where I think there is actually a great deal of interest in using open tracing, and actually a great deal of intent to use open tracing for that. And there are conversations taking place to like make that happen. But I should just be clear, it was the Kubernetes developers understanding Kubernetes is where they wanted to do something that was bespoke.
Hmm. Cool.
Sounds like they need some event.
All right.
More span reference types.
No comment.
Okay.
Yeah. OpenWhisk, someone was mentioning in chat, OpenWhisk, similar effort.
Yeah, there's an APR open there for installation OpenWhisk to understand what OpenWhisk is doing. Right? There is another one for the applications running on OpenWhisk, but that should take longer.
Oh, sweet, man, I'm having connectivity issues.
Ted, you should call in with your phone.
Okay. Sorry, am I roboting?
Somewhat. It's kind of fun, but you probably would be better.
Okay.
And I can like pretend to be if you want.
I want to carry on to the trace contents.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about that. I was going to talk about.
I think we're almost done anyway, aren't we?
Yeah, we're very close. I do think this next thing is sort of interesting, and I actually had a question for people about it. So if you haven't, you should look at the trace context GitHub organization and the trace context spec repo, which is the only thing that's in there. It's not formally part of, but it's sort of a offshoot of the open census work that's being led by Bogdan Drutu at Kugel, and Adrian and Yuri and many others have been participating a lot in it. I'm actually just kind of, like, I sort of have a question for people about it. The stated goal is to standardize on not the way that spans are described or serialized, but the way that like context data is sent over the wire between processes. So the starting point was a standard way to send trace context data over HTTP, and there are like a number of like kind of what I would describe as like syntactic issues that have come up, like just how to represent a given 64-bit number. Then there are a number of like sort of like not super complicated but still problematic semantic issues, like how wide should a trace ID be, like how many bits should it be variable length, that sort of thing. And then there are a number of much like bigger picture semantic questions, like there's some folks from Microsoft who are chiming in, and they have they actually pass a lot of like path data, like tracing lineage data through with the trace itself, and so their context needs to encode a bunch of information. There's like questions around how much or whether to include like open tracing style, or really I guess pivot tracing style baggage and everything. It's kind of interesting to talk about. The thing that I've been like struggling with, and I'm trying to I think maybe have like a quick poll here, and if anyone has any opinions, I'd love to hear them. Like whenever I think about standardizing this stuff, like especially in the context of let's say you were writing like a sidecar like Envoy or Linkerd or Nginx or something like that, and you wanted to support this format. There's one thing to like decode the bits, but then if you are participating in the trace, you have to be able to, you know, in some way you have to be able to like create a span. And to do that, like if there's a bunch of like tracer specific semantics that are encoded into like the context information, I'm unclear on like how this thing guarantees any sort of interoperability, because you'd still need to be able to like, you know, make sure that if Microsoft is going to be supported, like the way that they propagate lineage information would need to be supported by the Nginx plugin or whatever. And it starts to feel quite a bit like open tracing at that point, where you might be better off just saying the context is in a given place and it has like a given like base 64 encoding, but it's just a blob. And then you pass this blob off to the tracer and let it do what it needs to do for creating spans and so on. And I'm just like confused at what the purpose of it. I think maybe this isn't the right place to bring it up, but I mean, I can ask on that repo as well, but I think that would make them very upset. So like for people who've been participating on it, does anyone understand like what the end goal is? Like what interoper are we actually trying to achieve? I guess I'm sort of asking Yuri, because I think you've been spending a lot of time in it, but I don't get that.
I think there is one use case which is they have in mind, but it kind of presumes that the tracing systems are very similar in how they create spans. And the use case, imagine that there is no open tracing API for Java, right? Yeah. And so, but it exists for Go and other languages. And so we have Jaeger in all other languages, but nothing in Java. But in Java, you have this big ecosystem already covered by Zipkin. So that's, I think, the use case. They can say, okay, well, I already have my Spring integrated with Zipkin, with Sleuth, whatever the libraries are. So why can't I just use that with all instrumentation that Jaeger has in other languages, right? And then especially because you make an assumption that once you collect the spans from Zipkin, you can still kind of send them to Jaeger or vice versa, like to one tracing system in the back, which is what Zipkin does, let's say, with Stackdriver, right? It can send spans to Stackdriver. So I think that's the only use case really of the interop that I can think of.
I see. So you assume that the tracer's job within a process is to take these things coming in over the wire and then send a bunch of data out in some standard. So like there needs to be a pairing between, like to have interop, you need to both have standardization of this and of an out-of-band format like the Zipkin format that's sent to Stackdriver, or this doesn't make sense. Is that fair? Because like otherwise it just becomes this black hole, like that process in the middle that doesn't support Jaeger or something. Is that correct? Like you need both of those for it to make sense?
So I think for that use case, you need both. And I guess there's also another use case, which has to do with the X-ray. So if you have a bunch of your own services running with your own tracing system, but then at some point you make calls into hosted services like on Amazon, let's say, and they create their own tracing. So this is another use case for interop. If they can understand your trace ID, then even though you cannot view the trace in the same backend, you can at least correlate them in some way.
Got it. So like being able to at the very least extract a correlation ID, even if you don't have all the details correct, would be useful to span systems. And I guess that comes up with logging systems too. So that's another piece of it.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, login is definitely, I think, like someone actually restated the whole thing in terms of colon tracers, loggers on there.
Okay. Okay.
All right. I think Ben, you put the final things on the list as well. Do you want to just go over those last two items around Envoy and Open Census?
Sure. Yeah, there have been like some sort of informal conversations with people working on Envoy and to a certain extent Istio, sort of like along the lines of what I was just describing and discussing. I think there's like one world where you're focused on, or one frame of mind where you're focused on the use case where you have like a single tracing system that's observing, you know, an entire distributed system, and then another world where you expect to have multiple that are, you know, observing pieces of a system and then correlating in some way. I think that the flavor of the discussion in the Istio conversation is more focused on the mode where you have a single tracing system observing everything, at least within the scope of Istio or an Istio deployment, which is probably a fair assumption given the nature of that technology. So they were pursuing something that, we're excited about something that was considerably simpler than what's happening in the trace context organization. And I was actually supposed to have a drink last night with Bogdan from Open Census to discuss this exact topic, because what I don't want to see happen is, like, I don't want there to be a bunch of unnecessary churn between like the Open Census project, the trace context project, and open tracing. I would actually prefer, I don't really care where it lives, but it would be nice if there's only one effort going on in this area. But I feel that the requirements pulling from like the Istio world that are a lot different than the requirements that Yuri just outlined. So I basically just want to, I'm just trying to make sure this is out in the open and doesn't feel like it's not in the open. Like I want to try and like sort out a way of moving forward with this stuff so that we don't have like a bunch of partially overlapping projects. Like I think there's a way to have these different efforts just be like nested, if that makes sense. So we can have like a standard at one layer of the spec and then the standard a layer deeper if you want to get into like how you extract a correlation ID or whatever. So I'm going to try and make some progress on that, and it probably won't be on GitHub just because that's just like such a, in my mind, actually a very like time-consuming place to try and discuss like high-level stuff. But I will try to report back if we make any progress on that stuff.
Awesome, thanks. I was too lazy to sign back in since we're almost done and I wanted to hear the conversation. Apologizing if I still sound like a robot.
Good.
But we've, looks like we've gotten to the end of the established agenda. We still have a couple minutes left. If anyone has any final words they want to say or any final topics they want to bring up. So one round of that. Going once.
There's one that I had thought of, but I have forgot about it. So I'll bring it up next time.
This
Damn
is
it, man.
It's like a totally trivial thing, but you know, previous to this meeting, we actually had a a calendar invite that had individual people added to it. And then we switched this model where there's like this link for a calendar that you can overlay on your calendar. And I noticed that when we had the calendar invite, we had like 5 or 6 people from companies that are on the industrial advisory side of this who dialed in. And today, I think we have close to 0 of them. Maybe I'm not reading the usernames correctly. So I think that there's some like signal loss by having this calendar that you have to add to your calendar and realize that it's not like your normal work calendar that's been invited and so on. So I might kind of combine this by actually explicitly inviting people as well.
Yeah, I think you can manually add people to that same calendar invite.
I see. Okay, cool.
Nice.
So, okay, so I think I remember one thing regarding that trace context that I had in mind. So one of the things that I think is beneficial with having that is that propagation of the automatic propagation of the header, even across infrastructure pieces that might not necessarily be traced. And so I think that there's certainly some benefit in like having that as a standardized system, even though like we might not see the benefit in having like the cross tracer compatibility.
Yeah, totally. And I would say that I don't think anyone, even the Istio folks, would argue about that. I think everyone's in like violent agreement that like having a standard place from just like literally naming the header and like having enough information that at the very least you could pass it through, you know, like maybe you don't do anything else, but you pass it through. Everyone, I think that's a really good idea. The question is like how much agreement we need to have about the innards of that blob. Like the minimal thing is like literally no agreement. It's just like a version bit and a blob. Then there's like you have a correlation ID, and then you have a correlation ID and all this other stuff. And that's I think where the debate, like in terms of scoping, comes out. Does that make sense?
Right. So the other thing that I'm wondering if we could get some benefit out of this is having like so at least in the Java space, there's not really a good standardized system for context within a request. So maybe that could be a potential standard that could come out of this that frameworks could adopt as a way of like building out that context a little bit better. Other systems like I think .NET have that already in place at the language level. So I think that was something that your pull request Ben kind of touched at. So I think I like that.
Yeah, and Go has like inbuilt mechanisms for a certain type of context propagation as well. Yeah.
Cool. I think that was all that I wanted to talk about.
Yeah. I think we're pretty much out of time. So I think that was a good call. Gonna call it a wrap. Jump right in if you have any last things to say. And just one final shout out to the New Relic people. Thank you for joining, and I look forward to seeing you on the Gitters.
Welcome.
Thanks, Ted.
Yeah. Ciao, everybody.